For a long-term relationship to thrive, both partners need to be in it for the long haul. That doesn't just mean sticking together through thick and thin. It means growing together too. Personal growth, relational growth. It's not optional in a successful relationship, it's a necessity. Every relationship is going to hit challenges. Life throws curveballs, career changes, health issues, family problems. And when those challenges come, what separates the couples that survive from the ones that don't is their resilience, or even better, their anti-fragility. Now, anti-fragility isn't just about enduring hardship. It's about bouncing back from it stronger, facing the tough times head on, learning from them, and using those experiences to deepen your connection. Couples that embrace growth don't shy away from the hard stuff.
Welcome to Beyond Success, the podcast for high achievers seeking deeper meaning, fulfillment, and purpose. Now, here's your host, world-renowned leadership coach and therapist, David Tian, PhD.
Welcome to Beyond Success, Psychology and Philosophy for Achievers. I'm David Tian, and for almost 2 decades, I've been helping hundreds of thousands of people from over 87 countries attain success, happiness, and fulfillment in their personal and professional lives. And in our last episode, we uncovered just how destructive toxic relationships can be. We're talking about something more dangerous than a bad diet or a lack of exercise. Relationships that sap your energy, mess with your health, and shorten your life. And in this episode, we're flipping the script and getting into the how. How do you build a relationship that doesn't just survive, but actually thrives? A relationship that adds to your life, not drains it. And here's the promise. By the end of this episode, you'll understand the key relationship skills that are absolutely necessary if you want your partnership to succeed long-term. Skills that aren't taught in school, but are critical if you want to avoid the common traps so many people fall into. Now, why does this matter? Because without knowing these skills, chances are you'll never acquire or train them. And what happens then? Your relationship is at risk of either self-destructing in a blaze of fights, resentment, and bitterness, or slowly devolving into a passionless, lifeless partnership. Neither is where you want to end up. If you want to build a relationship that lasts, you need to learn and practice these skills. Okay, we've got 5 main points to cover today. Let's start with the first big skill, emotional awareness and self-leadership. This is kind of 2 rolled into 1, but they're connected. And this is a big one, because if you can't manage your own emotions, your relationship is going to feel like one endless roller coaster of reactions. This concept comes straight from Richard Schwartz, the founder of Internal Family Systems Therapy, IFS therapy. Schwartz's work has revolutionized how we think about emotional awareness. According to him, inside each of us are different parts, inner voices, beliefs, or conflicting emotions that often clash with each other. And in relationships, these parts get triggered all the time. Here's what that might look like. Maybe your partner makes a passing comment, and suddenly you're angry or feeling hurt. In reality, that comment wasn't the problem. It was one of your inner parts that got triggered. Maybe it's an old wound from your past or a deep insecurity. But instead of recognizing it, you lash out or shut down, and the cycle begins. That's where emotional awareness comes in. And the key here is self-leadership. For a relationship to thrive, both partners need to recognize what's happening internally in themselves. What are their triggers? What are the emotions bubbling up? It's about identifying those parts and taking responsibility for them. Too often, we expect our partner to fix how we feel. We get upset and we look to them to make it right. But the truth is, no one can fix your emotions for you. You've got to do that work yourself. Success in a relationship comes from being able to communicate what's happening inside you without projecting blame. Let's say you're feeling insecure or anxious. Instead of snapping at your partner or making passive-aggressive comments, you learn to communicate what's really going on. The truth is, I'm feeling triggered right now. This situation is bringing up some anxiety for me. It's a simple shift, but it opens up space for understanding rather than defensiveness. When both people in a relationship take responsibility for their own emotions, the dynamic completely changes. Arguments become less about blaming the other person and more about understanding each other. You create a safe space to explore your inner worlds together, which builds intimacy and trust, and that's huge for any long-term relationship. Self-leadership is all about taking ownership of your internal world. It's recognizing that your emotional reaction is yours to manage, not your partner's. It's not your partner's job to fix your emotional state. And it's definitely not helpful to project your feelings onto them and expect them to make everything better. Here's the skill you need. Learn to identify and communicate your emotional needs without blame. This means getting clear on what you're feeling and why, and then expressing that in a way that fosters understanding, not defensiveness. Let me give you another example. Instead of saying, "You never listen to me," which is loaded with blame and will almost definitely make your partner defensive, you could say instead, "When I don't feel heard, I start to feel disconnected and lonely." Do you see the difference? The first version projects the problem onto your partner. The second version takes responsibility for your own feelings and invites connection rather than conflict. It's a subtle shift, but it's huge. When both partners can do this, when they can recognize their own emotional triggers, lead themselves through their feelings, and communicate from a place of ownership, then everything in the relationship can change. This isn't easy, by the way. Most people are conditioned to blame others for how they feel. "You made me mad. You never support me." We throw accusations around when we're hurt, expecting our partners to magically fix what's broken inside of us. But no one else can manage your emotions for you. That's your job. And in a relationship, it's the most important job you have. Because when you take ownership of your own emotional world, you stop putting unnecessary pressure on your partner to handle it for you. Instead, you create space for both of you to show up as equals, two people who take responsibility for their own inner worlds and come together to communicate with respect and understanding. This is what separates thriving relationships from the ones that crash and burn. Couples who make it in the long run aren't the ones who never fight. They're the ones who take responsibility for their own feelings and work through those conflicts with self-awareness and leadership. And without this skill, the rest of the relationship skills don't matter. Emotional awareness and self-leadership are the foundation. If you can't own your own emotions, everything else is going to crumble eventually. It's the starting point for building a relationship that lasts. So if you want to succeed in your relationship, you've got to start with yourself. Recognize your own emotional triggers, understand where they're coming from, and then lead yourself through those emotions instead of expecting your partner to do it for you. All right, let's move on to the second key skill, mutual accountability and repair. This one is crucial, and Terry Real's work really shines here. In any long-term relationship, you're going to hit bumps, whether they're small misunderstandings or major conflicts. The key isn't avoiding those conflicts, but knowing how to repair after them. Renowned couples therapist Terry Real talks a lot about the importance of both partners taking full ownership of their own actions and the impact they have on their relationship. It's not about keeping score or blaming the other person. It's about stepping up, taking responsibility for yourself, and being willing to make things right. This is what keeps a relationship strong through the inevitable storms. Let me share a client case to illustrate. I'll call them Sarah and Mark. They originally came to me because, like a lot of couples, they were stuck in a loop of resentment and blame. Sarah constantly felt unheard, and Mark felt criticized no matter what he did. They'd have these huge blowouts, and then nothing. No real repair afterwards. They just try to move on without addressing the damage, which left both of them feeling disconnected over time. In session one day, Sarah finally said what she'd been holding back for years. "I don't trust that you care about how I feel." And that hit Mark like a truck. He'd always assumed that love meant never admitting when you were wrong, never showing weakness. In his mind, if he apologized, then he was somehow losing. So instead of stepping up when Sarah was hurting, he would shut down. His silence made her feel even more abandoned. Here's where mutual accountability comes in. Both of them had to learn that their actions, in Mark's case shutting down, in Sarah's escalating frustration, both of them were feeding this cycle of disconnection. It's not enough to say sorry and hope for the best. True repair requires real accountability. It's about owning your impact on your partner, even when you didn't mean to hurt them. In this case, Mark had to realize that his silence was his responsibility. He had to acknowledge that not speaking up when Sarah was upset wasn't just about him not being a talker, it was actively damaging their connection. And Sarah had to recognize that her way of expressing her pain, usually through criticism, was pushing Mark further away, even though she was desperate for closeness. Okay, so what did they do? They learned the skills to repair quickly and efficiently. They learned not to let emotional ruptures sit and fester. The longer you wait to address them, the more resentment builds up. Sarah and Mark made a commitment to address conflicts head-on, but in a way that focused on repair, not blame. After each argument, they'd check in with each other and ask, "What did I do that contributed to this?" And that's a huge shift from, "You did this and it made me feel XYZ." It shifts the focus from blaming the other person to owning your part in the situation. And when it came to apologizing, they didn't just throw out like a half-hearted "I'm sorry." They took time to understand what the other person really needed to hear. Mark started saying things like, "I can see how my shutting down made you feel alone. That's not what I want, and I'm going to work on being more present, even when you're upset." And Sarah's apologies became more about vulnerability too. She'd say things like, "I know I've been coming at you hard. I'm scared of losing you." And sometimes that comes out as anger. That's what meaningful apologies sound like. They're not just about making the other person feel better. They're about contributing to healing and growth in the relationship. Apologies like these open up space for both partners to feel seen, heard, and supported. Over time, Sarah and Mark started to break the cycle that they had been stuck in for years. Conflict still happened, but the difference was that they now had the skills to repair and move forward, rather than letting those moments tear them apart. So if you want your relationship to last, you have to develop the ability, the skill, to take accountability and offer real, meaningful apologies. It's not just about smoothing things over. It's about growing together through those difficult moments. When both partners can do this, the relationship becomes stronger, more resilient, and more connected.
Many high achievers struggle when it comes to managing their emotions or navigating their relationships, and they hit a wall when it comes to emotional mastery. Maybe you've noticed that stress, frustration, or anger is seeping into your personal or professional life, or you feel disconnected from those you care about. That's where David Tien's Emotional Mastery Program comes in. It's based on peer-reviewed, evidence-backed therapeutic methods to help you find happiness, love, and real fulfillment. Learn how to break free from the emotional roller coaster and start thriving in every area of your life. You can find out more at davidtianphd.com/emotional mastery. That's DAVIDTIANPHD.com/emotional mastery.
Okay, now let's move on to the third of 5 key skills, and this one is committing to growth and resilience. For a long-term relationship to thrive, both partners need to be in it for the long haul. That doesn't just mean sticking together through thick and thin. It means growing together too. Personal growth, relational growth. It's not optional in a successful relationship, it's a necessity. Every relationship is going to hit challenges. Life throws curveballs, career changes, health issues, family problems. And when those challenges come, what separates the couples that survive from the ones that don't is their resilience, or even better, their anti-fragility. Now, anti-fragility isn't just about enduring hardship. It's about bouncing back from it stronger, facing the tough times head on, learning from them, and using those experiences to deepen your connection. Couples that embrace growth don't shy away from the hard stuff. They evolve from it. They adapt. They don't just grow individually, they grow together. Personal growth is your responsibility. You can't expect your partner to do the work for you. If you've got emotional baggage, limiting beliefs, or bad habits, it's on you to address them. And the same goes for your partner. They've got their own work to do. And here's the key. You have to support each other through that process. Growth isn't always comfortable, of course. In fact, it's often messy. But when both partners are committed to evolving, that's when the relationship can really thrive. And this isn't just about fixing problems or troubleshooting. It's about a mindset of continual growth, always striving to be better as individuals and as a couple. Maybe it's learning to communicate more effectively. Maybe it's developing more patience. Maybe it's tackling deeper issues like trust or vulnerability. Whatever it is, the best couples never stop growing. And growth can be uncomfortable. And when things get hard, and they will, you need to have the anti-fragility or the resilience to keep going. This means not giving up when the road gets bumpy. It means committing to working through the hard stuff together. Trusting that the process of growth, even when it's painful, is worth it. And that's the third skill, committing to continual growth and being anti-fragile in the face of adversity. When both partners are on the same page with this, challenges become opportunities for deeper connection. Growth isn't just something you do when things are falling apart. It's a constant process that keeps the relationship alive, evolving, and thriving. Okay, now let's get into the fourth key skill, emotional regulation and boundaries. If you want a relationship to thrive, you have to be able to manage your own emotions, especially when things heat up. Conflict is inevitable in any long-term relationship, but it's how you handle those moments that makes or breaks the connection. The ability to stay grounded, regulate your emotional responses, and not let the situation spiral out of control. Boundaries aren't about keeping the other person out. They're about taking responsibility for your own emotions, actions, and thoughts, while not taking responsibility for the other person's. In a healthy relationship, each partner has to own their own emotional state and not expect the other person to fix it or take the blame for it. This is where emotional regulation and boundaries intersect. Okay, to illustrate this, let me tell you a story about one of my clients. Let's call them Jen and Eric. They came to me because their arguments were escalating really quickly. It wasn't that they were fighting all the time. It was that when they did, things would get out of control really fast. Emotions flared, words were said that couldn't be unsaid, and they'd both walk away feeling worse than before. They weren't solving anything. They were just hurting each other more. And here's where emotional regulation really came in. Jen had a tendency to get overwhelmed when they argued. She'd feel attacked, and then her emotions would overwhelm her. She'd raise her voice, or worse, she'd just shut down completely. On the flip side, Eric would get defensive. Instead of acknowledging how Jen felt, he'd throw up walls and start deflecting, turning the conversation into something else entirely. And the result was that they both felt misunderstood, and nothing ever got resolved. So the first thing they had to learn was how to regulate their own emotions in the heat of the conflict. This wasn't about suppressing how they felt or pretending everything was fine. It was learning to pause, breathe, and stay present, even when the conversation got really uncomfortable. Emotional regulation doesn't mean avoiding your feelings. It means acknowledging them and being able to manage them so they don't take over the situation. Here's a simple technique I taught them. Whenever one of them felt overwhelmed during an argument, they simply call a time out. Not to storm off, but to take a few minutes to cool down, gather their thoughts, and then come back to the conversation when they were both in a better headspace. It's like hitting a reset button, and it worked for them. Instead of escalating, their arguments started to slow down. They could actually listen to each other because they weren't reacting on autopilot anymore. But that's only half the story. They also had to establish clear boundaries. In any relationship, healthy boundaries are critical because they allow each person to take responsibility for their own emotions without making the other person responsible for how they feel. Boundaries mean owning your emotions and letting your partner own theirs. In Jen and Eric's case, they both had to stop blaming each other for their feelings. Jen's feelings of frustration weren't Eric's fault. Eric's defensiveness wasn't Jen's responsibility to fix. What they both needed to do was take ownership of how they felt themselves and communicate those feelings to each other without throwing them at the other person. Setting healthy boundaries isn't about distancing yourself or putting up walls. It's creating a healthy space where both partners can take responsibility for their own emotional well-being. And that creates an environment where conflict doesn't feel like a battlefield, but more like a conversation. One of the biggest shifts for Jen and Eric was understanding that they didn't have to solve each other's emotions. Jen learned to say, "I'm feeling really overwhelmed right now and I need a minute to process," instead of exploding or shutting down. Eric learned to respect that space and come back to the conversation when they were both ready. He also stopped jumping to conclusions and getting defensive, which allowed Jen to express herself without fear of triggering a blowup. And the result was that their fights became more productive. Instead of tearing each other down, they were working together to build each other up. They learned how to argue with each other, not against each other. So emotional regulation and healthy boundaries are the keys to managing conflict in a healthy way. When both partners can take responsibility for their own emotional states and set clear, healthy boundaries, then you create a space where both of you can feel safe, heard, and respected. And when that happens, the relationship can thrive, even through the tough times. And now let's get to the final skill: vulnerability and authentic connection. Without vulnerability, you're never going to have that deep emotional connection that sustains a relationship over the long haul. It's what allows intimacy to grow. But obviously, it's not easy. Being vulnerable means putting yourself out there, showing the parts of you that aren't polished or perfect. And for a lot of people, that can be terrifying. But real intimacy only happens when both partners feel safe to be fully authentic. When you can trust that the other person won't judge you or criticize you or pull away when you show who you really are, that's when the relationship can become something extraordinary and stand the test of time. So let me tell you about another client couple of mine. Let's call them James and Laura. They'd been together for over a decade, but when they came to me, their relationship had hit a plateau. On the surface, everything looked fine. They didn't fight much. They were friendly with each other, but something was missing. They weren't connecting on a deep level anymore. Laura felt like James wasn't emotionally available, and James, well, he didn't even realize there was a problem. It became clear pretty quickly that vulnerability was the missing piece. James had built up walls around himself, and Laura didn't feel like she could really reach him. He wasn't sharing his desires, his fears, or what was really going on inside him. And to Laura, it felt like he was hiding behind this emotional armor, and that left her feeling alone, even though they were technically together. The breakthrough came when James realized that his reluctance to be vulnerable was what was holding them back. He'd always thought that being a strong partner meant keeping his feelings to himself, staying calm, and never burdening Laura with his insecurities. But what he didn't understand was that his distance was what was hurting them the most. We worked on creating a space where both of them could feel emotionally safe. For James, this meant sharing things that felt uncomfortable, like the fact that he'd been feeling insecure about his career trajectory for the last couple of years, but hadn't told Laura because he didn't want to seem weak. And for Laura, it meant admitting that she was afraid of becoming invisible in the relationship, but she hadn't told James because she didn't want to rock the boat. This is what authentic connection can look like. It's about sharing these raw, unfiltered parts of yourself, the ones that don't always look pretty, and trusting that your partner will hold space for you without judgment as you share. And that's where emotional safety comes in. You can't be vulnerable if you don't feel safe. James and Laura had to build that safety over time by proving to each other, time and again, that it was okay to let their guard down. They learned to listen without jumping in to fix or criticize. They practiced being present with each other, even when the conversation was hard. And over time, those walls started to come down, and their connection deepened in a way neither of them had expected. And the skill here is cultivating emotional safety. It's creating an environment where both partners feel safe to express their true selves, without fear of judgment or rejection. And when you have that, then you can show up authentically, and then real intimacy can happen. The relationship becomes a space where both people can grow and thrive, not just as individuals, but as a unit, as a couple. Now, here's the thing about vulnerability. It's not a one-time deal. It's not like you get vulnerable once and then you're done. It's an ongoing practice. You have to keep showing up, keep opening up, and keep creating that emotional safety for each other. It's ongoing. For James and Laura, once they started opening up and being more vulnerable, then everything changed for them. They weren't just together anymore. They were now connected in a real, deep way. They rediscovered that spark they had thought they had lost, not because they were doing anything radically different on the outside, but because they were finally showing up as their authentic selves on the inside. So vulnerability is the key to real intimacy. Without it, you might have a surface-level relationship that might look good on the outside, but feels empty and dead on the inside. But when you allow yourself to be vulnerable, and you create the space for your partner to do the same, that's when the relationship can really thrive and come alive. It becomes a place of growth, trust, intimacy, and deep emotional connection that lasts. So let's recap the 5 key points we've covered today. First, we talked about emotional awareness and self-leadership. If you can't recognize and take responsibility for your own emotions, you'll keep projecting them onto your partner. Without this skill, conflict becomes a blame game. But with it, you're able to communicate clearly and constructively, building understanding rather than walls. Second, mutual accountability and repair. Long-term relationships aren't about avoiding conflict. They're about how you handle it. Taking responsibility for your own actions, offering real apologies, and committing to repair are what keep small issues from turning into major resentments. Third, we hit on commitment to growth and anti-fragility. Challenges will come, but couples who grow and evolve together, who support each other's personal development, they thrive. Anti-fragility in the face of adversity is what turns those challenges into opportunities for deeper connection. Fourth, we got into emotional regulation and healthy boundaries. Being able to manage your own emotional responses, especially in heated moments, is critical. And when both partners set clear boundaries, taking responsibility for their own emotions, the relationship becomes a place of safety and respect, not blame and resentment. Finally, we dove into vulnerability and authentic connection. Real intimacy only happens when both partners feel safe enough to be fully authentic and vulnerable. Without vulnerability, you might be physically together, but you're never truly connected. But with it, you create a relationship built on trust, openness, and emotional safety. Now, what happens if you ignore these skills? Relationships that lack emotional awareness, that lack accountability, that lack resilience or regulation, and lack vulnerability, they tend to break down. They either explode in bitterness or devolve into a lifeless, passionless existence. You go from feeling connected to feeling like strangers living under the same roof. And over time, that emotional distance becomes harder and harder to bridge. But here's the good news. Mastering these relationship skills opens the door to a future where connection deepens, even as life gets more complicated. Imagine a relationship where both of you feel heard, supported, and respected, where challenges become chances to grow closer rather than reasons to drift apart, where you don't just survive the tough times, you come out stronger together. This isn't some unattainable dream. It's possible. With these skills, you can create a relationship that not only survives, but thrives. One that's a source of strength, fulfillment, and connection for years to come. And that's what we're here to do, help you build that kind of relationship. Thank you so much for listening. If this has helped you in any way, please share it with anyone else that you think could benefit from it. If you liked it, please give it 5 stars on whatever platform you're listening to this on, and leave a comment or send me a message and let me know what you thought of it. I look forward to welcoming you to the next episode. Until then, David Tian, signing out.